Chapter 1, The Night of the Impact. The small town of Pinefield had its own unique charm, a blend of old-fashioned houses, neat gardens, and the encompassing pine forest. It was autumn. The air had turned crisp, the evenings were growing long, and people were eager to spend more time by their fireplaces. This was a season when even the busiest local farmers gradually slowed their pace, and the town seemed calmer with each passing day. But one night, this peaceful microcosm was suddenly disturbed. The sky was pierced by a brilliant flash, like an arrow tearing through the celestial vault. At first, it seemed like a meteor shower, but the trail of light moved far too swiftly, shooting nearly horizontally above the rooftops. Then came a roar, as if from a cannon blast. The streets trembled, farm animals outside town panicked, and those still awake felt their windows shudder. Dr. Richard Carvell, a biologist at the local university, was in his living room, reading an article on the possibility of extraterrestrial life forms traveling through space. It was an article his friend and colleague, Douglas Whiteman, an astronomer, had sent him. Richard suspected Douglas was at the observatory on the nearby hill, monitoring the night sky. In the doorway stood Amy, Richard's wife, who'd just put their 4-year-old son Ellie to bed. "Did you hear that?" she asked breathlessly. Richard nodded. He could still feel the echo resonating in his ears. Sounded like an explosion. Or an impact. He rose from his chair and peered outside. Darkness enveloped the neighborhood, with only a few distant streetlights flickering. Just then, his phone rang. "Douglas here," came a voice over speakerphone, trembling with excitement and nerves. "You saw that too, right? Something fell here. I think a meteorite landed in the woods behind Pinefield." "A meteorite? Really?" Richard pursed his lips. "We heard a loud boom, but I don't have the details yet." Douglas exhaled loudly, enough for Richard to hear. "I've got coordinates. I need you here, Richard, right now. If it's really a meteorite, this could be a monumental discovery. Grab your car and meet me at the university." Amy listened and gently touched Richard's arm. "Be careful. And please don't come back at dawn, exhausted like always. Ellie will definitely ask where you disappeared to." Richard gave her a quick peck on the cheek and promised to return soon. Deep down, though, he was tense. His instincts as a biologist told him any sudden impact from the sky could signal who knew what. He grabbed his SUV keys and set off. When he arrived at the university campus, it was nearly deserted. Outside the main building stood Douglas, a small but energetic man wearing a cap to protect his brown hair from the cold breeze. He greeted Richard with a smile, but there was clear unease in his eyes. "I found in the observatory logs that the object fell about 15 miles away, on that barren heathland past the woods," Douglas explained hurriedly. "I already sent 2 grad students to mark the spot. They should be back by the time we get there." Without further delay, they climbed into the university's off-road vehicle and drove down winding roads. As they left the last scattered houses of Pinefield behind, they were greeted by a forest lane carpeted in fallen needles. The only illumination came from their headlights, revealing tree trunks and the occasional pothole. After roughly 20 minutes, they came upon 2 parked cars. One of the grad students, Karen, stood there in a reflective vest, looking rattled. "Dr. Carvell, there's a really big crater," she said quietly. "We haven't dared to get too close yet. It's really hot, and, well, it's just strange." Douglas nodded. "I haven't had a feeling like this in a long time. Let's go." They skirted a small stand of trees and saw an irregular depression in the ground, about 5 meters wide, still emitting pungent smoke. At its center lay something that looked like a large mass of dark rock, split into several segments. Richard stepped nearer, feeling the heat warming his face. A sense of curiosity mingled with an unsettling dread. What if it's more than just a rock? As a biologist, Richard knew extraterrestrial material could contain microorganisms that might not be harmless in Earth's conditions. When he got back to the car, he prepared sterile tools and a metal case for collecting samples. He asked Douglas to watch his back. Karen shone her flashlight while taking photos with her phone. Richard leaned over a fissure in the meteorite. At first glance, there seemed to be something pale inside, thin, barely noticeable filaments. Incredible, Douglas whispered in awe, sounding both hesitant and fascinated. Richard crouched lower to get a better view of the crack. He couldn't shake the sense that something translucent was indeed moving, very slightly. We've never seen anything like this. Let's get a sample and study it carefully, he said quietly. As Douglas placed some meteorite fragments in a metal container, a cold wind blew, and lightning flickered in the distance. It felt like a symbolic end to the tranquility both men had known until now. They took a basic sample and left the rest for more thorough analysis in daylight. Karen and another student measured ambient temperature and radiation while Richard and Douglas headed back to the university. Richard realized that the push that had pulled him from his living room was justified. He had no idea this specimen would alter the course of events not only for Pinefield but possibly for the entire world. Chapter 2, Strange Behavior. Delivering the meteorite sample to the university lab was routine for Richard and Douglas. They had studied meteor fragments before, though never ones this fresh or evidently active. The ground floor lab, ringed by large windows, felt oddly claustrophobic in the stormy weather. Rain drummed against the window sills. Richard flicked on the lab's lights, turned on 2 desk lamps, and got the microscope ready. He retrieved the sample from its container, which was emitting strange warmth. "This is unbelievable," said Douglas softly, rubbing his face. "It's almost like it's alive. The temperature's gone up half a degree since we left the site." Richard carefully set the meteorite fragment on a disinfected tray and angled the digital microscope. Karen, who had come along, stood near the door, jotting notes while glancing anxiously at the entrance. Through the microscope, they watched that filament make a small, twisting motion. It was only a few micrometers thick but seemed to respond to light, and possibly the heat of a human body. Could it be some sort of crystalline structure that, Douglas began, but stopped when the filament jerked abruptly under the lens. Karen let out a startled squeal. After a few moments, Richard caught his breath and scribbled in his notebook, "Movement of the structure, likely biological origin." By the time they were done, it was nearly morning. They finally wrapped up, each heading their own way. Karen drove off to her parents' place, Douglas returned to his downtown apartment, and Richard went home to his family. Arriving at the quiet house, he found Amy asleep in bed, Ellie curled up with his teddy bear. He quietly changed clothes and lay down, but unease still gnawed at him. That afternoon, they reconvened in the lab, joined by a few other scientists. Richard proposed implementing an isolation protocol, concerned the filaments could be infectious, but the university chancellor dismissed it. "Until we have concrete proof it's dangerous, we can't impose a lockdown," the chancellor stated coolly. "We have other projects to consider." Meanwhile, Douglas continued behaving oddly. He seldom discussed the data out loud anymore, something he used to do enthusiastically with Richard, and instead jotted things in a notebook he refused to show. Sometimes he glanced over his shoulder, as though worried someone was watching. His usual wry humor had vanished, replaced by strange silence. In the evening, Richard returned home, where Amy and Ellie greeted him. Ellie squealed for his father to play cars with him. Richard promised, but his mind was weighed down by thoughts of the strange organism in the lab. Amy pulled him aside. "You look worried," she said kindly, searching his tired eyes. "Maybe I'm just worn out," he tried to evade the full truth. But Amy wasn't convinced. "Take a day off at least," she suggested. Richard forced a faint smile. "I can't. This might be a historic discovery. If it really is alive and extraterrestrial, we have to preserve it, but at the same time, I have a bad feeling. He trailed off, unsure how to explain the dread that was growing inside him. He wanted to believe it was just a natural apprehension towards something unfamiliar, but that animal sense of fear wouldn't let him go. Chapter 3, Growing Suspicions. Rumors swirled in Pinefield the next morning. People claimed to have seen strangers standing aimlessly at the roadside, unresponsive when approached. An elderly shopkeeper said a customer came in, stared at her with wide eyes as though he didn't understand any words, and then left silently. Most residents chalked it up to stress or mental health issues, but these accounts multiplied. When Richard arrived at the lab, he found Douglas huddled in a corner. Douglas stood up slowly, wearing a blank expression. I feel like something's controlling me, he said with a grimace that was wholly unlike him. Richard tried to get him to see a doctor, but Douglas refused, attributing it to exhaustion. Then he walked off to his office, leaving Richard deeply uneasy. More signs compounded Richard's worries. Karen, once bright and chatty, now stayed silent. She had dark circles under her eyes as though she hadn't slept for days, and if anyone asked her anything, she'd just smile vaguely and turn away. Richard called an old friend, Professor Niels Becker, who had studied microorganisms in extreme environments. Richard described what he'd seen under the microscope, how the filaments appeared mobile and sensitive to external stimuli. Becker immediately caught on. Richard, he said over the phone, if you suspect it's entering people's bodies, we need a quarantine. This might spread by mere touch or airborne droplets. But telling that to the Chancellor, he'll want hard evidence. Gather samples from the infected, if you can. And please, be careful. Richard felt some relief that at least Becker shared his concern. But Amy, his wife, worried about him more every day. He returned home late, always exhausted, tension shining in his eyes. Ellie tugged at his sleeve, asking him to play, but Richard often brushed him off in his fixation on the analyses. An actual clue arrived by chance. One evening, Douglas abruptly disappeared, leaving a container of samples open. Richard discovered that part of the meteorite fragment was missing. Moreover, the filaments looked divided, as if someone had taken them. And it happened when no one else was around. That same night, talk spread that local people were acting even stranger, as though hearing someone whisper instructions to them. Several families reported a relative who suddenly got up and walked off wordlessly, only to return hours later seeming emptier. Richard knew this couldn't be random coincidence. It has to be linked to that life form, he realized, dreading how serious it might become. Chapter 4, The Infection Spreads. The university tried to maintain a facade of calm, but tension ran high behind closed doors. Some students stopped attending class, and a few faculty members behaved in bizarrely uncharacteristic ways. Even the Chancellor, who'd recently insisted there was no reason to panic, now looked weary and at times spoke incoherently, skipping words. Richard decided to act independently. He phoned Becker, and they agreed he would send a portion of the sample to Becker's lab in a distant city for an independent analysis. He used a specialized courier to dispatch it. Meanwhile, the situation in Pinefield worsened. People complained about hearing a strange humming at night and encountering familiar faces acting foreign. Amy urged Richard to get at least a bit of rest. You know how worried Ellie is. He's asking if you'll rake leaves with him in the yard tomorrow. You promised. But you're never around. Richard realized he was neglecting his family, but something told him the crisis could be so severe it endangered all of them. Douglas barely showed up, never answered his phone. Richard feared his friend might already be fully under the alien organism's influence. The first results arrived from Becker, and they were devastating. Tests confirmed the filament-like structures contained unknown proteins and could mutate to fit their environment. They likely invaded the nervous system. Becker deemed it an extraordinarily sophisticated mechanism, apparently learning how to control the human brain. If it spread widely, the outcome could be catastrophic. With that in mind, Richard decided he'd take Ellie to stay with his parents, who lived 40 miles away, hoping it would be safer there. Amy didn't appear obviously infected but seemed anxious. While packing for a few days away, she occasionally paused, as though losing track of her thoughts. "I'm fine," she insisted, "just worried, you know." Richard took a breath. "Amy, if you feel anything, let me know. I'll protect you." In town, emergency workers in white masks began patrolling in a makeshift joint operation with the local police. Officially, they declared it an atypical flu and emphasized hygiene and limited contact. But Richard knew the filaments under his microscope didn't match any typical bacterium. He feared the menace ran much deeper. Chapter 5, Confrontation in the Lab. One evening, Richard returned to the lab to gather final microscope data, unsure what exactly he was looking for, maybe a weakness in the parasite, or some sign it could be halted. Entering the dim corridors of the university, he noticed the lab door was ajar, the lights off. He pulled out his phone for a flashlight and stepped in cautiously. A figure stood by the lab bench. By the phone's faint glow, Richard recognized the face. It was Douglas, but his expression was vacant and menacing. "Douglas?" Richard breathed. The man turned. His eyes were wide, oddly empty, and his face rigid. His hands shook. Suddenly, he lunged at Richard. A flash of metal from the bench revealed a scalpel in Douglas's hand. Richard instinctively jumped back, colliding with a metal shelf. Several vials toppled, shattering on the floor with a crash. Douglas froze momentarily, as if something held him back. He let out an animal whimper. "Run," he said brokenly, eyes flickering with a hint of the man Richard once knew. But in the blink of an eye, that expression vanished. He slashed the scalpel wildly. Richard ducked, managing to knock the blade away. Douglas snarled and delivered a punch to Richard's ribs. Pain shot through him. Both men staggered and fell. Richard tasted blood in his mouth. "Douglas, snap out of it," he yelled, struggling to break free. But Douglas seemed to have the strength of two men, swinging again and trying to choke him. In desperation, Richard grabbed a small oxygen tank from the floor and swung it into Douglas's shoulder. With a desperate groan, Douglas let go and Richard scrambled free. Quickly, he scrambled to the door. Glancing back, he saw only an empty lab and shards of glass. Douglas had vanished into the dark corridors. Shaking, he headed for the main exit, sprinting down the stairs. He knew the evidence was now undeniable. If gentle, even-tempered Douglas could reach such a state, the parasite must have fully taken over his mind. And I might be next, Richard thought. He had only one priority: find Amy and Ellie, get them away before it was too late. Chapter 6, A Forest Hideout. Dark clouds gathered over Pinefield, as if nature itself conspired to heighten the grim atmosphere. Richard bundled Amy and Ellie into his car, deciding to flee to a hunting cabin owned by his parents. It was deep in the pines, well off the main road, hopefully remote enough to stay off the parasite's radar. Amy stared out the window in silence while Ellie slept in the back seat, exhausted by the day and the pervasive tension radiating from his parents. "Will you tell me what's going on?" Amy asked softly at last. Richard gripped the wheel. "Something is spreading, Amy. That meteorite wasn't just a rock, it carried a life form invading people. Part of the town, they're acting strangely." Even Douglas, he couldn't finish, suspecting Douglas was already lost. Amy reached for his hand. "Then let's save Ellie." Richard nodded. He knew it wasn't just Ellie, it was everyone. But family came first. They arrived at the cabin by nightfall. The surrounding forest whispered in the wind, and though it was calm, Richard's nerves stayed frayed. Inside, he lit the old stove, turned on a battery lamp, and bolted the door. Amy settled onto a wooden couch, cradling a sleepy Ellie. The fire crackled, and for a few moments it felt like a refuge from the chaos. Still, when Richard tried calling Becker, there was no signal. He resigned himself to waiting until morning to devise a plan. In the middle of the night, Richard woke with a jolt. Something jarred him from half-sleep. Beyond the windows, he heard faint footsteps, then a whisper. He hurriedly pulled on a jacket, dropped low to the floor, and peered outside. In the darkness, he glimpsed a man's silhouette, or maybe two, disappearing behind the tree line. Even here someone is watching me? He wasn't certain. But his instincts told him to prepare to leave at first light, taking Amy and Ellie somewhere safer. Where? He couldn't guess. If the parasite was in Pinefield, it might already be creeping higher up the chain of authority, ensuring no region was safe. Still, he had to try. Chapter 7, The Heart of the Colony. The next day, Richard set out to a nearby village where a friend had a small internet connection. He wanted to send Becker an email with updated findings. However, as soon as he reached the village outskirts, he saw uniformed men patrolling, men with cold, vacant stares. One moved forward, hand raised. "Turn around, sir. This area is closed off due to infection concerns," he snapped. His eyes were lifeless. Richard decided it was best to leave. Dread seized him, the infected have taken over the countryside, too. Before he could return to the cabin, a black van swerved in front of his car, blocking the road. 5 armed men jumped out, moving in eerie unison as if silently communicating. They pulled Richard from his vehicle, tossed him in the van, and shoved a cloth bag over his head. He heard the engine start. Ellie and Amy hadn't been with him, they were still at the cabin. Richard clung to hope they remained safe. After an interminable ride, his captors hauled him from the van and led him through what felt like a factory hall. Once they removed the bag, he stood in a wide space lit by harsh neon lights. Around him were large metal tables, crates of chemicals, and extensive equipment. Men and women he recognized from City Hall, from university corridors, and even General Thompson, known from television, stood, eyes just as empty. "Dr. Carvell," Thompson addressed him, "so good you could join us. Your insights on our organism were quite useful. Now you can help us end this chaos. The parasite brings peace. True unity." Richard swallowed. "It brings enslavement. I know it infects the nervous system, taking over people's thoughts." Thompson gave a chilling smile. "That's a matter of interpretation. War and suffering vanish when humans unite. You either accept it, or we'll make you accept it." He gave a slight nod, and 2 armed guards seized Richard. Richard glimpsed a familiar face in the corner, Douglas, sitting at a computer, motionless, studying what looked like a brain scan. Douglas didn't even look up, appearing devoid of any human spark. "What about my family?" Richard shouted. "Where is Amy?" "My son." Thompson shrugged. "Your wife will soon be one of us." "The child?" "We'll adapt later." A wave of helpless rage coursed through Richard. Chapter 8, Forced Cooperation. After a lengthy interrogation in which they tried to sell Richard on the parasite's benefits, they moved him to a side lab. There, he saw a machine for generating aerosols, next to it, vials of fluid in which tiny, living filaments quivered. With this aerosol method, an emotionless soldier explained, infection can spread extremely quickly. We need you to improve its chemical stability so the filaments survive transport. Richard's gaze dropped to the adjacent table, covered in documents. Glimpses of headings like adaptation in brain cells or effects of ultrasound on filaments grabbed his attention. He remembered Becker hinting that certain frequencies might harm the parasite. Perhaps there was a key here. He found some notes in handwriting that likely belonged to Douglas, mentioning that certain ultrasonic waves caused the filaments to seize up. This might be the lifeline, thought Richard. But he remained guarded by 2 armed men, and from somewhere nearby, he heard the echo of boots, General Thompson and other infected patrolling the corridors. He caught a glimpse of Amy, who approached with that same impassive expression. "Richard, she said monotonously, why do you resist? The parasite will end all pain and war. It can do that. Just surrender. Richard turned to her, heartbreaking. That's not you, Amy, but she smiled faintly. Are you sure? Maybe it's me, only now I can be truly calm. Stop fighting, please. It was as if real Amy and the parasite alternated control of her voice. Richard shuddered. First, he had to find a way to harness ultrasound to destroy the parasite's hold. He just needed time, and access to the generator. While feigning interest in chemical data, he looked for anything useful. Eventually, he located an old technical manual on ultrasonic cleaners and frequency modulators. He discreetly jotted down the frequencies that could destabilize the filaments. Then he resumed his role as a cooperative scientist. Chapter 9, The Decisive Clash. Tension ran high, the atmosphere electric. General Thompson announced that an outside army unit, apparently uninfected, was on its way to resolve things in Pinefield. The infected forces prepared for battle, finalizing an aerosol release to rapidly infect the incoming soldiers. Richard knew time was short. He had to enact his plan, rig a makeshift ultrasonic device capable of hitting as many people in the facility as possible, hopefully disrupting the parasite's control, even if just briefly. But assembling the parts under watchful eyes wasn't easy. After hours of searching, he found an old ultrasound machine once used for disinfecting lab equipment. He grabbed some wires, a transformer, and tried boosting the machine's power while fine-tuning the frequency. He knew it might hurt human ears, but if it could break the parasite's hold on the mind for even a moment, it'd be worth it. He passed Douglas in the hallway. Douglas was wandering aimlessly, mechanically operating a computer. Richard tried speaking to him, but Douglas only mumbled something incoherent, gaze unfocused. I can still save him, Richard thought. If I can disrupt the parasite. Amy approached him occasionally, trying to persuade him that resistance was futile, but each time Richard saw the faintest flicker of emotion, perhaps regret or sorrow, behind her eyes. Was a part of her still in there? When the sun set, sirens blared throughout the factory complex. Gunfire erupted and shouts rang out. The attacking troops were attempting to breach the building, and the infected soldiers responded in coordinated fashion. Flashes lit the windows, the ground shook with a minor blast. Now! Richard's mind screamed. He grabbed his improvised ultrasonic module, plugged it into an outlet behind a dusty breaker panel, and started it up. Suddenly, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Amy. Don't do this. We could be together, now and forever, without fear or pain, she murmured. Tears shone in her eyes. Richard hesitated, longing to embrace her, to beg her to come back. But he switched on the power and turned the dial to the preset frequency. The air began to vibrate. Chapter 10, An Open Ending, Salvation or Downfall. A piercing tone reverberated, faint to normal human ears but painful to the parasite's filaments in the infected brains. A group of infected soldiers in the main hall staggered in spasms, some cried out, others simply shook uncontrollably. Richard's heart pounded. He glanced around for Douglas. Spotting him on his knees, clutching his head in agony, Richard saw him momentarily relax and lift his gaze, his face etched with suffering and astonishment, like a man waking from a nightmare. Richard, Douglas whispered. Richard raced toward him but tripped over tangled cables. 2 gunshots echoed. General Thompson, himself in pain, had managed to grip his pistol and was firing erratically. 1 bullet ricocheted off a metal table, sending sparks flying. Then he saw Amy. She stood in the center of the chaos, arms outstretched, as if stopping Richard from confronting Thompson. Tears streamed down her face, her features twitching. Clearly, the parasite was fighting to regain control. Please, stop, she moaned, seeming caught between her real self and the invader. Richard had no choice. He dashed back to the ultrasound device, cranked the power to maximum. The room filled with an awful shriek. Dust rained down from the ceiling. General Thompson collapsed, gasping, but managed to fire once more. The shot was aimed at Richard. Amy threw herself in front of him without hesitation, the bullet striking her in the chest. It happened in an instant. Amy fell with a choking gasp, just as Thompson himself lost consciousness under the full ultrasonic assault. Richard dropped to his knees beside her. "Amy," he cried, cradling her. Her lips moved faintly, her hand grazed his face as if trying to speak one final sentence, but life drained from her eyes. She went still. Stunned, Richard could not even weep, consumed by a hollow feeling of guilt and sorrow. Meanwhile, the fighting in the hall reached a crescendo. Another explosion rattled the building as external soldiers apparently tried to demolish the site. He had no time. He had to escape to find Ellie. Summoning the last of his strength, he picked up what remained of the ultrasound device, now just inert scrap, and fled toward a side exit. The corridor was strewn with bodies, some dead, others merely disoriented. For a moment, the ultrasonic waves had let them regain consciousness, but the chaos, gunfire, and armored vehicles outside signaled certain doom. On the way out, he saw Douglas slumped against a wall, a mixture of despair and tears on his face, appearing momentarily human again. Spotting Richard, Douglas groaned, "Forgive me. I didn't know." Richard knelt beside him, but then gunfire erupted nearby. Douglas had been shot in the shoulder, blood seeping through his clothes. "Run," his friend pleaded with his last breath, a shaky grip on Richard's wrist before his arm fell limp. Douglas went still forever. In tears, Richard rose, crashed through a hole in the wall, and disappeared into the darkness amid flying bullets. Once he was away from the compound, he spotted an abandoned jeep. Overhead, the complex was under siege by heavy artillery. Explosions shattered windows, flames licked up the walls. But even the attacking soldiers seemed in disarray, unsure who was infected and who not, and perhaps some of them were already compromised as well. Completely spent, Richard started the jeep, tears stinging his eyes. Amy was dead, Douglas was gone, and Pinefield, who knew what state it was in now? He felt only numbness. By dawn, he reached a hill overlooking the town. In the first light of day, he saw only smoke, blackened building silhouettes, and scattered lights reminiscent of ongoing military activity. No clear hope. No peace. Surely the parasite had spread far beyond, and even if it was contained here, it could be thriving elsewhere. With trembling hands, he switched off the engine. One thought remained in his head: find Ellie. Save my son. Yet emptiness gnawed at him, for he knew the world had changed forever. An unspoken question lingered: is there any chance left for humanity to stay free? Or did this monster appear only to quietly devour us all, until nothing human remains? Are we really the only civilization to fall prey to this alien parasite? For centuries we've searched the skies for signs of intelligent life, sending messages into the void, hoping we'd meet friends or kindred beings among the stars. But what if every potential civilization out there that ever transmitted or could have answered us is already claimed by this creeping force, robbed of its free will? When I stare into the dark sky, I feel an unsettling fear. Could every advanced society we wish to find actually be nothing more than colonies governed by this very organism? Could there be no real others out there at all, only parasites that have learned to perfectly mimic whichever species they overtook? And if this monster, the one now prowling our veins and minds, can so easily dominate humanity, why wouldn't it be doing the same on countless other worlds? I don't want to believe we're just another hatch for this cosmic hunter. But the more I replay the scenes of Pinefield's desperate struggle, the more I realize this may not be the only front under siege or in retreat right now. Perhaps all communication in the cosmos fell silent long ago, because once free civilizations simply lost their voices, everywhere the parasite conquered, rewriting the faces and thoughts of all who resisted. Yes, I still cling to a spark of hope that our civilization, though battered, can fight. But what if this is just another forlorn effort in an endless chain of defeats? What if everyone we might have encountered is already no longer themselves? Even so, I have one wish left, to save my own world. And if it turns out that no truly free soul remains in the entire universe, I'll still fight. As long as I draw breath, hope remains, if only for this one planet.